Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I am your host, Beth Bailey, and my guest today is Jordan Kane, who was the team lead for the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction's report on aid diversion by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And Jordan, I was telling you before we started recording, I am such a huge fan of SIGAR, which is the acronym, for the Special Inspector General. And all the work that they've done. And so it is absolutely an honor to have you talking about this and getting into the nitty-gritty of what happened with that report. And I also want to tell people some about your background. I did write up a small intro. Jordan's got her bachelor's degree from Pomona University and her master's from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She has worked for a plethora of really important institutions like the Department of State, Booz Allen Hamilton, USAID, DT Global, and SIGAR. And also you volunteered with Operation North Star, which is really great. I dealt with some Operation North Star folks when I first started covering post-withdrawal Afghanistan, so I have huge appreciation for what you guys did there. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been a long-time listener, first-time caller, I suppose.
That's hilarious. I love it. This is going to be a fun time. I'm super excited to dig into this. So can you give everybody the background on this report? By the time that you started working on this report, how long had you been at SIGAR and what kinds of other things had you worked on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sort of proposed the idea for the report before I took over leadership of the team for a variety of reasons that I won't get into. But we had typically had sort of a top-down process where the Inspector General would come to us and say, election rigging and donor support to elections is something that's of interest. Try to flesh that out and come back and we'll talk about the specifics of it. But in this case, so I guess for the first part of my career, been an aid worker working in conflict zones, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Yemen, Rwanda, and had experienced, worked on or in Yemen just before the Houthis took Sana'a, and South Sudan before and after the civil war broke out in 2013. That's a bit more complicated. We still have a relationship with that government, but it's a strained one. And then in August 2021, when the Taliban took Kabul, I was really interested in the sort of lessons learned and challenges you were delivering aid to people living under a friendly regime who had a seat at the table when you were making decisions about what sectors to prioritize, what regions to prioritize, what groups of people to prioritize. And all of the sudden, that's a hostile relationship. And you, instead of allowing them to sort of help make those decisions, are trying to prevent them from having any influence over where that aid is going. And that's a very complicated shift. It does have a number of similarities across different contexts. And so that's where the idea came from. And then in the summer of 23, but you asked me how many years I had been at SIGAR by that point. I had been there for 5 or 6 years by that point.
Fantastic. And that would be a huge shift, right? You're covering things with US probably malfeasance, and which continued after the withdrawal, where state and AID wouldn't give the documents that SIGAR requested and things of that. There were lots of things, I'm sure, that carried over. I guess let's start with that. What was that shift like for you, going from covering our own issues to now how does the Taliban play into this more acutely?
Yeah. Well, first I would say it was just, and you've heard this from so many different people, I'm sure, a shock to the system, even though it wasn't intellectually surprising. I remember being at a meeting at the ARG, which was the presidential palace I'm trying to remember, it was 20 or 21, and we had one of our counterparts from the office of the president, this was under Ghani, asking, what is your annual spend on our military? Just give us a ballpark number because we need to figure out what happens when you withdraw. And I remember it just being so shocking because we were obviously not the right person to ask that question in my particular team, but it was a moment of desperation, and my boss had a friendly relationship with this person. Sorry, where was I going with this?
We're talking about the prior versus what
Yes.
happened when, yeah.
Yes. So the fall of Kabul happened. I was visiting my sister in LA, and I just sort of like everyone, stopped doing anything except trying to figure out what positive role I could play, because I had worked all over the globe in conflict zones and was acutely aware of the fact that it's our allies who often suffer. I mean, it's also Americans, obviously, particularly in the military. But for me as a civilian, myself and my colleagues, I had just lost a number of colleagues, or had a number of colleagues face really serious danger. So I wanted to know what positive role I could play, and felt very guilty about people that I lost over the years. So, for example, I worked with the mayor of Kandahar city pretty closely in 2011 when he was killed by a turban bomb. I had another colleague around that time who was shot in the face for refusing to steal a motorcycle from a DoD funded project. We had comms on that. They had, I think, the military unit that I was embedded with had uh, signals intelligence, so we had a pretty specific timeline of what had happened. In any case, then like a couple of weeks in, maybe, my boss came to me and said that SIGAR, because we had had an office in Embassy Kabul, had the ability to refer our sources and allies to the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program. And he asked me to go through hundreds of our work was very interview heavy, very interview focused. And we had a lot of people who told us things that could put almost anyone, except the think tank folks, were putting their livelihoods in danger and often needed to be on a not for attribution basis. But a lot of our Afghan sources had already survived assassination attempts, and were putting themselves further in danger by speaking to us. It felt like a sacred trust, trying to maintain their anonymity. So in any case, I went through hundreds of interview transcripts and tried to determine who had stuck their neck out the most for us and given us information that was really critical to the work that we were doing. And in a lot of cases, for our particular team, it was folks who had worked on the electoral integrity, meaning trying to prevent election rigging, trying to prevent members of the Haqqani network and the Taliban from running for office. Why did they want to run for office? Because if you obtained a seat in the Afghan parliament, then you got immunity from prosecution for anything. So basically what you would do is you would get into what people would do was get into parliament, and then they would establish a contracting company, make a ton of money, use that to buy their way into Congress, and then the parliament, rather, the Willa Sijirga, or the higher house. And then they would be immune for prosecution for crimes, related to the wealth building that they were doing. It wasn't a great system.
Wow, I'm not surprised. I didn't realize that about the Afghan government, that you would be immune from prosecution if you made it that high, which almost seems like, in a country where you know that there is corruption and that there is, a pretty lengthy history of retribution sought not just by the Taliban, but by different, warring clans, that might not be maybe the best thing to do. I don't know. I wasn't my job to think of that, but wow, that's surprising to me.
I made the list, and this sounds overly dramatic because it felt overly dramatic, but I don't mean to dramatize the experience. I made a list of the sources that I recommended that we refer. And in retrospect, I wish I'd taken gender into account more than I had. But we referred them on to the State Department. And then my former boss and mentor, and just someone I really deeply respect, reached out to them over WhatsApp. And a number of our sources got back to him and said, "Thank you so much. But also, what do I do today?" Because, in one case, he and his family had, I think, they had 13 bodyguards. His son had a bodyguard going to high school. Like, in some of these cases, the Afghan government internally had, like, very clearly, I've got just tons of paperwork because we applied for their humanitarian parole, documented that there had been previous attempts on these folks' lives because they were trying to defend their democracy and serve their country, and also serve, I think, the ideals that the United States was investing massive amounts of money and blood in advancing. And so that's how we got connected with Operation North Star, as we helped some of them to get into North Star. And Tarjaman was another organization. The North Star helped me connect with Tarjaman, that had safe houses that got some of our guys in.
Oh, that's an amazing thing. Yeah, North Star is the group that sent me the pictures of reprisal killings that changed my life forever. I still remember the very like the day that those came into my inbox and the moment because I was cross stitching at the time and I saw it on my phone. I put down the cross stitch and I went and got my computer because I knew I didn't want to look at them, right? I didn't want to see it. But I had to, and I didn't pick that cross stitch up for years because I didn't have time anymore. All of my free time from that moment on was what can I do to stop that, you know? And it just, it's you can't over dramatize it because we all knew what was really happening and it was incredibly dire and very scary. So I want people to realize like that's not, you're not being dramatic. It was a very scary time and people were doing whatever they could from a world away to keep humans alive. Um, so you got the people into the safe houses. How many of them were successfully able to use US RAP or HP to get out of Afghanistan?
Gosh, I hadn't actually, I think I tried not to think about that number because it was, let me think, just to start from the beginning. I got one family to the UK, one to France, one to the Netherlands, one to Canada, two, three to the US. So that's, I don't know, I've lost count, but it was only one family that came here through US RAP. There was another woman who I helped get to, she got on one of those unsanctioned flights to Emirates Humanitarian City and was there for, I'm sure she would correct me, like 5 or 6 months in, you know, detention, immigration detention in the UAE. And then I got US RAP to pass her name off to Canada. So she had the P1 and the P1 was referred on to Canada. Canada was interested in a specific profile that the United States, I think, really deprioritized, which was single women and female human rights defenders. Just generally, the US system prioritized military interpreters, sort of zero units. And there were we wrote about this at SIGAR, actually. I got it into writing. A friend of mine, Katie Howard, described it as the best way to make it to the United States was to be a wife or a daughter. If you had been unmarried or if it was the woman who was the primary applicant. We actually had the statistics from the State Department, but under an NDA. And we never were able to write an op-ed about these dynamics. Even it's a long story. But in any case, that particular woman was also a P1 who made it to Canada, sort of because US RAP, but also Canada was taking these US RAP referrals because they knew that the process was just so slow as to be almost non-functional.
I had forgotten about that. I remember how angry I was when US RAP wasn't processing for people, and yet we were farming them out to other countries. And I wish I would have realized that particular statistic at the time because it's like you said, you wish you had thought about gender more. Nobody knew what was coming. I think we all thought that this was coming, right? But the Taliban kept saying, "Oh no, we're not gonna, we're gonna treat women with the respect that Islam demands." And it's like, yeah, you're Islam, which has always been the same. And yeah, to see, I just heard from one US RAP woman the other day who, she won't get processed. She's stuck in Pakistan, single young woman. What's she gonna do? She can't go back. She's endangered if she goes back to her country and it's like there's nothing I can do for you and it breaks my heart. So it's terrible.
And it was so expensive to help folks take advantage of those US RAP pathways. I would say in one case, they had a US RAP pathway and the UK just came through faster. In another, yeah. So sometimes it was just they would take a faster path.
Yeah.
Because almost was as slow as we were.
Yeah, we said 12 to 18 months for these people, right? If they went to Pakistan. But Pakistan, and the interesting thing is that nobody knew for a long time that Pakistan was dragging their heels because they didn't want an RSC in their country, from what I understood. And then when that finally got started, though, it didn't push processing any faster. And yeah, people were buying. At one point, I worked with Operation 620 for a little while. And we were trying to help somebody who was an NDS employee. We wanted they wanted. I did not want this because I knew he didn't have the money to pay for it. And I didn't see that he actually had a pathway to safety. Nothing was moving. So it seemed very stupid. And thank God he didn't do it. But they wanted to get a big safe house in Pakistan that was going to cost an awful lot of money and have him pay for it until they could get other people to move in and offset that cost a little bit. But like, there was no, he would have been just out so much money. He wouldn't have been processing. He never got a US rap referral. So he would have been there and he would have been not able to work as a refugee. He would have still been concerned because ISI over there and NDS, like, being an NDS employee, you're unsafe wherever you go, basically.
That's
It
been
just,
undercovered too. One of the families that I supported, they actually had Pakistani intelligence, Pakistani security. They didn't exactly know who they were, show up at their home. The father was invited to a meeting at ISI headquarters. I mean, he turned it down, but they were very much under surveillance, even in the country.
yeah, I heard that all the time from people who were like, no, I'm not going to go over there because my friends in NDS are already in. So yeah, there were so many things that people were learning in real time that were very dangerous, very scary, very expensive. And, how long can you afford that? That's what really drives me crazy. I know we're here to talk about, this one report, but I also want to talk about the fact that like CAS is closing, right? Think about all the people who are at CAS who are being told, we'll give you several $1,000s to go back if you choose to go back. Some of these people sold their homes and all their belongings in 2021, went to Pakistan, and then had to pay through the nose to live in Pakistan until they could be moved to CAS for processing, and then got stuck there for how long? And you're like, $4,500. Like, no, I'm sorry. That does not begin to make up for what these people have given out because we promised them something. And Biden drug his heels on it and Trump ended it. And these are humans who are, anyway, I'm digressing. I really want to hear about you guys' report, but I'm big mad right now. So this is a dangerous time.
It is, and I don't even know what to say to salve that wound. These are just for people. I imagine your listeners are much more educated than most people on these issues, but just for people who haven't followed this closely, the Afghans that were brought to CAS in Qatar were brought by the U.S. government. They didn't fly by themselves, so it's a sort of different level of responsibility, I think, that we owe them when sending them back to Afghanistan.
Yep, and they say that they won't. I think that by the time this comes out, this article will be out. State Department has told me that the Trump administration will not send them back to Afghanistan. However, at present, the CAS people I'm talking to say that it's an African country that they think that they're going to be sent to. And they're like, why? We don't want, that's not acceptable to us. So they might not send them back to Afghanistan. But if the other choice is someplace like Rwanda, they're going to choose to go back to the place where at least they know the language and they know, where the bad things are and where the good, I would make the same choice, I think. I mean, it's a terrible choice, but it's just, like you said, they were moved there by the US government. I'm assuming that they have that in their passport when they come back. Immediately.
I'm sure that their risk is higher. And as someone, I've lived and worked in both South Sudan and Rwanda, and I know that there are other countries that have accepted their country refugees, but the idea of showing up as a refugee in either country is unimaginable to me. Rwanda has a pretty high cost of living. South Sudan is one of the poorest countries on earth. I mean, it's got 3 paved runways and almost no paved roads. It's the size of Texas. It's difficult, I think, to envision what that would be like.
Yeah, I can't imagine that. Let's move forward. Jordan, let's talk about what we came here to talk about. I really want to hear about how, you've got to start taking care of your sources. You've also got to find new sources, right, to document how the Taliban are diverting US aid. And I guess I would love to, because you probably have a better access on this than anyone. there were always the stories about the 500,000 US dollars that were getting sent on pallets. You guys have documented how much money we gave to Afghanistan. How was that money given and what mechanism was used for it, I guess?
Sure. No, it's a great question. One of the things that I really enjoyed or thought was important to outline with our report, which is called A Broken Aid System. It's not a title that I was consulted on. That's a long story. I don't like that title. I think it's overly simplistic. But one of the things that we really focused on was there are, and I think an organization called Unlike Aid has really focused on the fact that a lot of the money that the US gives as humanitarian aid or as foreign assistance is used for overhead or for administrative costs of the various entities that manage it and help to get it to beneficiaries. I think that's a very valid criticism. I also think that most people oversimplify why that happens. It's not exclusively because these organizations are, trying to profit or pay their executives well, although in some cases with USAID contractors, that's a valid criticism. But it's largely because of oversight requirements. And I say that having worked in oversight. There was a lot of fear about any sort of scandal and a lot of just very arcane and demanding rules that had to be met in terms of complying with USAID and congressional reporting requirements, financial requirements, anti-human trafficking. Like none of these layers were a bad idea in isolation. But what it ended up being was this idea that, and I think the Trump administration is sort of talking about, let's just give aid directly to local NGOs. It'll be more efficient. We'll cut out the middleman. It's a great idea in practice. And I think a lot of the conversations about reinventing aid go from the old system was broken, let's blue sky it. And they ignore the fact that you haven't changed the sort of congressional incentives or the regulations on the books that are making it such that aid, especially to places where we don't have a strong relationship, where we don't recognize the government, like the Taliban, it often goes to the UN first, then it goes to an international NGO, then it goes to a national NGO. And because the chain of people entities that touch it is so long, a lot of it is lost in, people that are fulfilling reporting requirements, people that are fulfilling financial reporting requirements, people who are doing Leahy vetting, meaning making sure that it's not going to people who are committing human rights abuses. So I get frustrated because that middle hasn't changed, and yet the conversation is sort of moved on. That was pretty wonky. Apologies.
No, I think that's really important. And it's certainly an argument that I see a lot in my non-Afghanistan work too, with, well, we don't need this part of the UN because we can give this aid directly. And yeah, if we did that, yes, but if we're not, I know that we give a lot of aid through UNDP and, other things. And so there is that everybody takes a bite of the apple. But what about the size of the bite that the Taliban were taking?
Sure. And I get that question. And I should also just say about the UN, they also play a role in terms of coordinating. Like, if you try to imagine what it would be like to be a local NGO that has different financial and like writing requirements from like 10 different countries, it's really crippling. And that's what leads to, a lot of the staff having to focus on those report requirements instead of focusing on figuring out who the neediest people are, figuring out how to get the aid to them in ways that best end run the Taliban. And sorry, I'll get to that question, but let me also say that someone explained this to me or to my team when we were doing the research. And I think it really it helped me to get my Western mind into understanding the size of the challenge of delivering aid under a regime like this. So if you are a humanitarian organization, because most of the aid going to a place like Afghanistan, and our case studies, by the way, were Gaza, Yemen, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, and Afghanistan. I don't think I'm forgetting anyone. So places where the United States doesn't have a strong relationship or just overtly doesn't recognize the government. If you are a humanitarian organization following the principles that have been established since the 60s, I want to say, I could be a decade or two off, You are trying to prioritize starving babies. You're trying to prioritize unaccompanied children, children-headed households, female-headed households, and sort of marginalized communities like the Hazara, for example, as a shorthand. And at the end of your list are parts of the Afghan populace that have historically been tied to the Taliban and are being favored in terms of social services and other decisions. And at the very end are sort of military fighters, members of intelligence services. But you are, multiple times a day, just constantly having to negotiate with a regime that has the guns. They control the border entry. They control the court system. They can disappear people. And you have to negotiate with them for everything from a license to operate, which in Afghanistan is the Ministry of Economy gives you an NGO license, to they will do audits of your staff. They're going to review your finances. You have to pay taxes on. So it's difficult to understand how many times a day and how many people and how many levels of interaction and negotiation there are, I think. But to answer your question, because we did receive it quite a bit, I can't give you an answer, and I'll tell you why. Because it was described to us as at the Ministry of Economy registration as an NGO, or, it's not, UN agencies don't register with the Ministry of Economy, but they have a different process. But just getting that very initial permission to operate is a negotiating point with the Taliban. Then you go down a level and you have to, if you're an education NGO, deal with the education department, or Ministry of Education. And then you have to deal with it at the provincial level, and then you have to deal with it at the district level. And you're going to have people coming and asking you why you have, someone speaking Dari coming to deal with registration paperwork. So they're also massively interfering with your staffing. It's just so multifaceted that it's like not even at a single level that I could give you an estimate of that percentage.
Sure. And then there were things like, if I remember this report correctly, the Taliban were trying to put their people onto NGO staff, which then is a money suck that goes to the Taliban instead of to a local NGO worker that isn't affiliated. And I mean, I don't know if this was happening by the time that you guys were collating this report, but in the very beginning, the Taliban used to put out the imagery of themselves at aid distributions for like WFP and stuff like that. And they were there and they were watching. And that in and of itself is like an oversight mechanism where if you were someone who, worked for the former Afghan government, would you go to that aid distribution? I don't think so. And I remember reporting that they were going to starve out our allies if they couldn't just kill them directly. So that, there are just so many things that they're getting involved in. They finally stopped putting those pictures out.
Mm.
Or maybe they made that page private. I don't know, but I was reporting on it an awful lot and then it suddenly went away. But you had people who put their lives at risk to find out what was happening. What were they finding out for you about how aid was really being distributed on the ground?
I mean, I think the first thing I would say is we actively promoted, when we were allied with the government, the previous internationally recognized government, we, USAID, we state, we, the sort of US government and other donors, not only tried to put an Afghan face on things, meaning give them credit, give the Afghan government co-branding with the US government or other donors, but a seat at the table in making those decisions. And so this is what's so weird about that moment of transition between a regime that the US government and other donors support and one that they don't, is that the Taliban, low-level officials sometimes stay on in between that shift. Not often, but it does happen. And so that they've seen, even the Taliban has been monitoring, because they've got a sort of shadow political, unit in any level of government that they have a real presence in. They know what the previous government's role was in distributing aid and identifying beneficiaries, in, being promoted as being part of getting legitimacy from that distribution. And so it's a very weird thing that all of a sudden they don't have a role and you're actively, and I'm not saying that they should, I'm just saying you have to think about it from the perspective of an Afghan, and it's a very different thing. But in any case, we had, I'll tell you, I was in an interview and it was with the director of a local NGO. And I said to him, I'm trying to understand the multiple times that you have to negotiate with the Taliban government in the way that I just explained. Someone described it as at every step that you go down, you have to pay a bribe or you have to make a negotiation. And, I've worked in the country, but I'm not steeped in it and I'm struggling. Can you explain to me what that is like to struggle with that every day and to try to reach the people that you think are neediest and irrespective of their political affiliations? And he said, I am happy to tell you about that, but can I start at the beginning? And we were on a Zoom call. So I was on video, much like I am with you right now. And I was really trying to not show that I had no idea what he was talking about. And what he said to me was, well, I mean, first I have to pay off UN OCHA to get, you know, assigned to cover this sector in this particular part of the country. And then if it's like WFP, then I'm negotiating with WFP. And when we first heard this, and I say we because we always had multiple people on interviews like this. I told my team, like, this is not a core part, it's not a core theme of our report, and it's like pretty shocking. Let's just put this to the side. And these sorts of comments kept coming up. So it wasn't something that we went to look into. And so anyway, the picture that ultimately emerged was that the Taliban would very intentionally get their people hired on at UN agencies. They would also, so the UN doesn't deliver aid itself. It works through an international NGO, and then a national NGO is often like delivering the food aid or whatever. So the Taliban would force local NGOs, I called it zombification, to take on, often it was like a friend of theirs or a brother of theirs as a vice president or a director, someone in a decision-making role without buying in, because even though it's a nonprofit, it's like a profit-making entity. And then that person would be a mole and helping to direct aid to the populations that they favored and skimming off a percentage. And you might ask, how do they skim off a percentage? This is a nonprofit entity. Well, they would often do it, or they allegedly, again, this is what our sources told us. For example, if it's a food provider to WFP, WFP also procures its food through a major wholesaler that might be importing from the UAE or something, or trucking in from the stands. They would just buy substandard food. And in some cases, we were told that the food it had rocks in it, it was inedible. Sometimes it'd be used for animal forage, and sometimes it wasn't possible to do that. So that's how you get that higher, you get the profit margin. And the same thing, staff within the UN, the Taliban would force UN agencies, like if you want permission. And I'm not trying to talk smack about the UN. I'm trying actually very hard to demonstrate that they're in such a difficult position. And I think especially WFP, because it's such a fungible commodity. And if you think about trying to distribute food aid across the country, and I think this is a pain point I know this is a pain point in other contexts as well. I've worked a little bit on Somalia, and there's and Sudan, there's some stories with WFP contractors. But I mean, they're just having to negotiate to reach all over the country with this thing that's so easily handed over as a negotiation. And a lot of the times, as terrible as it sounds, a lot of the time, I think the people making that decision to hand over a portion of what they're delivering are making that decision because they're trying to protect the rest of it to reach, the population. They're trying not to just say, no, we're going to turn around.
Yeah, I think I would hope that is true. I know in the beginning I had people telling me the same thing. WFP aid had, the flour was full of uh worms, and that it was not fit for eating, and that, the Taliban were giving the aid to their friends and to people who were, Pashtun members of their tribes, and that everybody could tell that that was happening, or to people who had money, that
Sure.
people would show up in cars to get the aid. And it's like, if you have a car, you don't need, well, and not in this case, they said, and it was the very beginning. So it's interesting that continued, that, I didn't have as many sources on the ground as time went on to tell me things like that. It's just terrible. And so as you're seeing all of this, how is it shaping? Because I know that the report that you wrote is not the report that ended up getting out. And so where did the facts start to dissolve away, I guess?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Our former Inspector General read the report recently, and he had read earlier versions and had a lot of feedback that was, I really enjoyed working for him. And he said, where did it go? Where did the substance go? A lot of the length was cut. And I should give context. The Inspector General for SIGAR was fired along with, I might get the number wrong, but I think it was about 19 other inspectors general. It was in January. And so without sort of a public explanation being provided, according to a law, I believe from the 1970s, the administration has to give Congress 30 days notice and a reason before firing an inspector general, and that sort of process wasn't followed, so there wasn't like a documentation of the rationale. But when that happened, the acting inspector or the former deputy inspector general was elevated to acting, and the rest of the front office remained the same. And it was my perception that they were just quite concerned with staying in their positions and not upsetting the Trump administration in whatever way the previous inspector general had. Again, there was a lot of fear in government at the time, and there was just a lot of ambiguity about why that decision had been made. And so as a result, this report that we'd spent maybe 2 years writing, I mean, it was book length and had 100 sources, I think 90 actually. There was a 9-month really painful back and forth process of editing that I would call really censorship, that there was so much fear that they were just trying to, like, I was explicitly told, like, I think that the lesson of this report should be that we shouldn't send aid to these places. And I was like, well, historically we have stopped short of making recommendations of that policy, what we would call a policy recommendation, and we've stuck to, if you're going to send aid to these places, here are the ways that we think it could be done with less diversion. Here's the ways that we think it could be done more efficiently for the US taxpayer and for the recipient. And there were just a series of awkward meetings where it was very clear to me what they wanted me to say. And I would say, look, we talked to 90 people. This wasn't what we were asking them. And in fact, there was a survey by FCDO, I think, or DFID, FCDO, not DFID, of Afghans about whether they thought the aid should continue, given the high rates of diversion. And even Afghan women sort of came out marginally in favor of the aid should continue because it's reaching enough people that are just hungry otherwise. But anyway, that was just not a question that we had historically taken on, and it wasn't one that I was trying to take on. My argument was always, we've sent aid to people living under the Houthis for like a decade, and the situation in South Sudan has been strained for more than a decade. So what are the ways that we can do this better or worse? And it got to a pretty shocking level. Like, as I said, the name of the report was changed to A Broken Aid System, which is a title with a very specific message. But also, even what I considered to be very think tanky and very wonky analysis. Let me give you an example. I had written about USAID OIG doing what I thought was some really interesting and impressive work. They were saying they documented how much the agency was concerned with and trying to crack down on diversion under the Houthis. At that time, there was a Southern internationally recognized government, and they made the point, you guys should, there's also documented diversion there. We should make sure that we're not overly focusing on regimes that we don't like because diversion matters everywhere. This kind of message, like, let's just not get that too imbalanced. And to me, that's a pretty, like, inside the belt, I don't know, very policy-based message. I got a written comment back from our front office saying that was un-American. There were other sections of analysis that were called anti-American and criticizing America. And I went to my boss at one point and just said, hey, I work for the Lessons Learned program, and I don't know how to do my job, which often involves not criticizing our country. I mean, I feel deeply patriotic. I felt so grateful to serve the American people and serve Congress and play the advisory role that we got to play with state and aid and DoD. But I have to be able to criticize, missteps that have been made in the past so we can make better policy decisions in the future. So I just don't understand these bits of feedback that I'm getting are difficult. Like, I actually said at some point, should I continue to come to work? Like, is this a role that you still want me to play?
That had to be so terrible. And I mean, that's We were talking about this before we got started, right? I am My job as a journalist is to say uncomfortable things and to bring uncomfortable things that this country and other countries do to light. And it doesn't mean that I'm not I am very enamored of my country. I think it's the best thing going. But not everything is perfect. And if you can't say, hey, this can be done better. And like, the OIGs and the inspectors general, they exist to make sure that the American taxpayers are benefiting, that their money is not going into places where we don't want it going. And to the most extent possible while also doing the good work. USAID, OIG does a great job, I think, at that. And I know that they would say, don't discontinue the aid. That is never the message. It is, how do we make sure that the least amount of taxpayer money gets diverted? How do we make sure that these programs are doing what they're supposed to do? It's not anti-American. That had to feel so frustrating, and I'm sorry that happened. That's not okay. And it's not how anybody should feel either.
I had been there for 8 years at that point, so it was just I thought that I knew how we did things and the role that we served, and it was shocking because it was so inconsistent with what had experienced under. And I mentioned this to you also before we started recording, under multiple administrations, under multiple, both parties had controlled all of the different congressional committees that we had worked closely with. There had never been this sort of intense self-censorship for partisan reasons. And I should also make it clear that DOJ never came for us. This was sort of, I guess whatever the decision was with the previous inspector general set the tone, but it wasn't that there were people from the Trump administration inside providing this guidance. It was sort of self-censorship from our front office, and that made it like even more shocking to me. I always felt that we were trying to, I actually, I don't not felt like I feel strongly that we were advancing efficiency in the US government, that our goals were consistent with at least the title of that organization, and was like super proud to work with. We got inquiries from members of Congress from both parties, from like state and aid. They were always, we need 15 pages on this by tomorrow, but on things like, we're trying to pass a bill that makes it easier for diplomats to get outside of the bunker, like embassy, to get out and do their job and interact with the people who, in the countries that they're trying to influence and to understand. And so I or my team would send back answers to those questions so that this member of Congress, whoever it was, could advocate with their colleagues to get something included in the NDAA. I think that was the Diplomatic Safety and Security Act of 2022, but it was just very wonky, and I was really proud of what I did and felt like it was serving, people from all perspectives and all parties.
Well, and I know it was. I know that every time a new report came out, even if I didn't get to read the full thing because you guys were so thorough, right? But there was always something in there. In fact, the last SIGAR report I wrote about for my current employer, because there's always something of importance, and it never felt like it was political. It always just felt like, because so much of post-withdrawal Afghanistan has been politics, somebody slinging mud at somebody else, only one side, not both sides. That's like, I will slam both sides, right? I don't want to slam one side only, because that would be it would not be true. And so that's what I loved, is SIGAR had facts, things that came from people that saw. Yeah. Anyway, I could always get really good facts from everything, and I'm just, it's nothing is ever as easy behind the scenes, I guess, as I don't know. I'm just saddened. I would love to talk about, some of the other things that were happening too during this. In that report, in the intro, it's mentioned that one of the sources was killed while engaging in helping getting that information. Can you talk about what happened to that source?
Yeah, I can. It's not an easy thing to talk about, and it's something that we carried with us. So my team in particular had done a bit more of, I think the lessons learned program, which was the part of SIGAR that I worked in, which was just really a cool and unique place. We believed that we were the only think tank like entity within the 74 inspectors general of the US government. And there had been talk at one point of moving us into another part of government like OMB, like sort of retasking us and giving us a broader mandate, which was exciting and unfortunately didn't happen. But my team in particular, which was like 3 of us at any given time, did a bit more of what might be described as investigative journalism. We wrote a chapter in 21 about President Ghani and his innermost circle rigging, or allegations of them rigging the 2018 parliamentary and 2019 presidential elections. And that's the only thing that, prior to the firing of Inspector General Sopko, we didn't end up running with for obvious reasons. I mean, it was politically explosive. But then during this report, we got these repeated statements about, yes, I'm happy to tell you about the Taliban's diversion, but let me tell you how integrated they are within the UN system and within the national NGOs that serve the UN, as well as international NGOs. Even GDI, which is the Taliban's intelligence service, monitors UN and aid distributions quite closely. And there's, there's a whole relationship there. But where was I going with this? I've lost my train of thought again.
We were talking about the source.
Awesome. Awesome was his, is not actually his name, so I can use it, was the name that we called him. And I can't verify all of this except to say that I spoke to Bassem. I believe what he told me. I've got other, the source that introduced us is an American, and I believe what he told me as well. He's very involved in helping the former ANDSF community, for example, access medical care, because as you said, food aid is delivered based on your affiliation with the Taliban and political support prior to their takeover. But this is the same thing with access to medical care. And I've got a story about that with one of my own sources shortly after the fall of Kabul. But in any case, Bassem was trying to collect information about the diversion of food aid to Taliban military camps. And according to Bassem, not just a Taliban military camp, but a place where there were expatriates training as well. And so the allegation was that it would have been other terrorist groups that had found haven in Afghanistan. And he had made video recordings as part of his role as working for an Afghan NGO. So it's often one of the most dangerous aid delivery roles is that last mile of delivery, because you have information about the way that aid is being preferentially delivered, or even just explicitly provided to Taliban soldiers. And he was providing these videos to another part of the US government that was investigating, the presence of allegedly of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And this was months before. This was when the US line was that there was no Al-Qaeda, or that Al-Qaeda was very much diminishing in importance, significance, and numbers in Afghanistan. And not that long after the UN came out with some reports saying quite the opposite, and documenting a number of provinces and specific locations where allegedly Al-Qaeda was training in Afghanistan. So this was another moment when I said to my team, like, we need to figure out if this is classified. We need to figure out, the redaction of this transcript, and also let's not get distracted by this because it's a single source. We started to get other allegations along the same lines, and I started to give it more credibility. But in any case, Bassem was caught making these videos, and he was apprehended. And as occasionally occurs, the tribal leader was able, this is my guess, I'm actually filling in between the lines here, but in any case, the family was able to secure release, and he fled to Iran. And then he ended up coming back. I believe it was a relative's funeral, as it often is. And he was apprehended a second time, and he was not released. He was killed. And I say that with a heavy heart. There were also a number of other interviewees who told us, I was detained and beaten by the Taliban. Arrested, I guess is the word, but it's difficult to say. Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking, and I remember reading that and thinking how horrible that that happened, and yet we know that that's been happening, right? This is not news, although not usually for this particular. It's usually, you know, oh, you worked for the military in the days of yore, but the Taliban don't want people to know what they're
Yeah.
doing. And I'm not surprised. And I don't know. I don't want to ask you to talk about how difficult that is, because that's really a rough thing to ask, and I know, I think I can imagine.
Yeah, I asked him if he wanted to talk to me, right? Because I mean, he acknowledged that this wasn't a safe thing to discuss, and I just said, look, we had a policy of turning down anyone who wanted to do an interview or who we had contacted, and then they asked, can you get us out of can you get me out of the country, because it felt unethical to ask for information from someone like that. So I said, look, you've acknowledged that it's unsafe for you to speak with me. I Why do you still want to do it? Or do you still want to do it? I Keeping you safe is more important to me than writing about this. And he said, I've already shared this information with another part of the US government. It's already been The Taliban have become aware, or they're on to me. I would rather you get it out there, because it's not going to change the danger that I put myself in. And it reminded me a bit of um, Mayor Hamidi, the mayor of Kandahar, back in 2011, before he died, had a meeting with us in the Kandahar PRT cell. And somebody said to him, this was a time when Kandahar city was like a rest and recreation center for the Taliban. There wasn't a lot of active fighting, but they would use KC for making bombs, for like literally just taking a reprieve from the front lines, which were in Zari and Panjwai, Arghandab maybe to some degree. Um, and somebody said to him, you were an accountant in Northern Virginia. Your family must be just, it's gut wrenching for them to watch you be in danger here. That the assassination campaign was the main way that the Taliban was fighting the Afghan government, and not just the Afghan government, but like USAID contractors and DoD contractors and this sort of thing. They were assassinating them right and left. And he said, I want to serve my country. I want to serve my country as long as I can. And I know that it's not going to be that long. And that was not that long before he was killed. And my sense is he wasn't a perfect man. I mean, I think there was a lot of, anyway, I shouldn't comment on that. But yeah, that's how it felt with Bassem. It was also a level of bravery that I just really am not sure I can conceive of today.
Yeah, I've never lived in a place like that, you know, where that was something that I would have to choose to do. And so, you know, here, if you're a whistleblower, you're protected.
Yeah.
There, you're blowing the whistle, and you're gonna, if somebody finds out, that's it. Goodbye. Like there's nobody to protect you. Geez, the Taliban had a teenage child murder the the people who murdered his family, like gave him an AK, and that was their restorative justice, because these people this had like killed multiple members of his family, and so they took this teenage kid and were like, here you go murder him now. It's like this is who the Taliban are. This is what we don't here, that would never happen, you know? So it's very hard to try to conceptualize what life is like. I don't know. I'm going off on a tangent here, but yeah, the bravery of having to stand up to a group like that is immense, and it's very important that those things get out. And
I
so
think,
I've always said too, like imagine trying to do what you're doing, what you did at SIGAR, right? In the 96 to '01 period, with no social media access, no cell phones, like you would never have gotten this out. And that it's so brave that people are doing that despite the danger, because they know the world has to see it.
yeah,
I don't know.
absolutely. And the people, it's the vast minority, especially like when I'm asking a question like, how can the US better support elections? Or when I was at SIGAR, we would get a pretty high hit rate. People in certain circles had read the reports and liked the reports and wanted to be part of it. But when we were asking about aid diversion under hostile regimes, it was a pretty low percentage of people, very understandably, who would respond, even amongst Western aid workers. And so the Afghans who were willing to talk about that stuff, and I'm in particular thinking of a couple of gentlemen who worked for third-party monitors, which is basically like, I don't know, like an auditing entity that says, if you're within the UN or NGO system, you're obviously more incentivized to say that diversion isn't occurring. So they hire this third party entity. And that's an incredibly dangerous job, right? Because it's your whole job to speak truth to power, but you're not living in Washington, in the Washington, D.C. environs like myself. It took particularly brave people. And I had a couple of sources in those roles who just were really impressive to me, really heroes to me. And obviously we took, I mean, should also say that we took pretty serious measures to protect, my team took pretty serious measures to protect their anonymity, up to and including not keeping their names on our shared drive because, obviously there wasn't top cover. My work was being called un-American. It's not that I wouldn't have turned it over to an entity that was trying to be thoughtful and investigating these allegations, but I didn't want their names to be mishandled because they were in such serious risk.
Well, and they're smart to do that. Think about the UK list.
Disclosure, yeah.
Yeah, the list that went out, and you never know where that goes. You can't be too careful with that. I'm in fact I've been trying to help someone, and it's like a very well known journalist group put this person's name out, and they asked, I'm sure, for them to use their name, but it's like I would never. You couldn't pay me. I think I've used one Afghan's full name because they insisted, and they had gotten to a safe place when they asked, and I thought, and it was Moscow, and it was right before Ukraine, Russia, and I didn't see that coming. And I don't know what happened to that person. I'm sure they're still in Moscow, probably, but that was the one time I used a full name. Never again. Don't care. No.
And it's often a case of endangering the family that still remains.
Yeah, that's the whole thing, is you really have to have a macro view of this, because Afghan families are so much bigger than the way we conceptualize family. And even if you have somebody who's made it to the US, when that used to mean something, it doesn't mean that they don't have so many people back home. And I've seen it. I've just, it's devastating. I guess, I don't know. I shouldn't say I've never done it, because now I'm thinking about all the times when, somebody else has already broken it. And so you use the name, and then you hear, so it's horrible. All of these things are so scary and so devastating. And you see what happens. Retrograde, the man who was in retrograde, who was murdered. And I watched that movie and thought it was incredible. Never once thought about that. And there it happened. Yeah, I'm glad that you guys took that level of care to protect these people, because you just don't know what could happen. There is, and speaking of families who are endangered now here, because that was something that was never supposed to be a concern, right? That if you made it here, you're okay. You said something about one of the families that you helped who had humanitarian parole, and there are complications. Can you talk about what's happening with that family?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking. So one of my sources who had survived a couple of different assassination attempts, he had his adult children. So basically, he was one of the ones that we emailed and said, would you like us to refer you to the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program on the basis of your, cooperation and in putting yourself in further danger by sharing information with a U.S. government entity? And he said, yes, but I am the dad of a large family, and I've got several adult children who are not going to be, like, we had a very difficult conversation on a number of different occasions. And I said, the P1 criteria are just not, they're not going to cover your adult children, even though they live with you, even though they're very much still part of, your family in a different way than they would be in the West. And they ended up moving to Pakistan with him. We eventually sort of, through North Star and Tarjaman, were able to help people with P1s move to Pakistan so that they could process, because processing was not available in Afghanistan. And in this particular family's case, this was, I hesitate to even, I think I tried not to think about how much it cost overall. And we had a lot of individual donors, just Americans who stood up and provided funding through a nonprofit to get visas and, provide housing and stipends for food and heat and this sort of these very, very basic expenses during that time. But in any case, his adult children, we ended up applying for humanitarian parole, and we had a pro bono attorney who'd never done a humanitarian parole case. I mean, these are thousands of dollars per individual applicant, and she filed for 7. The baby was born later, a large family. And in any case, they came, so just so that listeners who may not be familiar with this program can understand, they went legally from Afghanistan to Pakistan. They then were in Pakistan for 2 or 3 years, and they were working by the end, but it was difficult for them to get the permission to work. In fact, some of them worked for care contractors by the end out of Islamabad. They're really remarkably resourceful as a family. In any case, they got to Northern Virginia through humanitarian parole, and they did that because they got stamps in their passports out of the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, because I think a lot of people have feelings about people entering the country through border parole. I'm not trying to disparage that, but just in case you do, this was not that. They got stamps in their passports in Islamabad to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars for life support and the Pakistani visas and all of this, and then flew to the United States, continued to work for this. They had jobs as soon as they arrived. They had benefits. It was just, and they continued to work multiple jobs. They're going to community college, all of this, super resourceful folks. And they are facing, potential deportation because the latest administration has been reversing parole protections issued by the previous administration. And I'm not trying to say that to make a political statement. It's just really painful as an American who found another American to provide pro bono legal support, and a third American who is the beneficiary of a trust and wanted to find ways to pay it forward to our Afghan allies. She didn't even have a connection to the Afghan war. And so it was really just this beautiful coming together of people that didn't know each other at all to support this family, that they're very easy to help because they help themselves, right?
I think the other thing that, in case people are not aware, because yes, so many stories are about parole getting revoked from border crossers, right? It was insanely difficult to get humanitarian parole. I have only spoken to one Afghan who got humanitarian parole, and she makes more money than I do working at Pfizer, and she's younger than I am, and she's absolutely incredible. And the way she had to escape, she's been on this podcast, so anybody can go back and find her. But her escape story is absolutely insane, because there's a timeline. You have to get to a certain place in it's obscene.
Yeah.
This was not easy. Sure. Right. That is a 1 in a million shot that how many millions of dollars did USCIS rake in from humanitarian parole applications that went nowhere?
$575 a pop, and this was a family of 7.
Yep. And it was I've written about it so many times because it's obscene. And there were some talk about if you could file to get the money back, but I never heard of anybody getting the money back. And so many people who filed those charges were, Flanders Fields, American volunteers, Operation North Star did it. I mean, so many volunteers liquidated their own money to help people and didn't get that HP. And so I didn't realize, I'm so glad you brought that up. I didn't know that parole was getting revoked for humanitarian parole and not just you crossed the border and were given parole when you came in,
It hasn't yet for Afghans, but I believe it has for other nationalities. I worry so much about them. I tell them never go to an in-person immigration meeting without giving me a heads up, because I'll try to take off work and go with you, just as not to interfere, not to say anything, but just to be a silent observer. Because anecdotally, I've heard that having a white American go with you can improve your chances of having that hearing go positively. And I would love to provide moral support. I worry about them all the time.
It's really, I'm glad that you're doing that. It's so difficult at the moment. And it's just heavy, right? I mean, think the levels of heavy of all of this. We all have a different heavy, and I feel like mine is less bad than all of the people like you, Jordan, who are dealing with, these cases very intimately. But, um, this is a deeply affecting period of time, and
I
it
don't
just
know how that's
continues.
right,
Yeah.
because asylum filings are not being processed. I'll tell you the thing that I am most worried about is work visas. Work visas for asylum seekers. Last I heard, and it was from another volunteer who works for a law firm that handles a lot of Afghan cases. When you file for asylum, historically, the United States government has issued a work visa because they understand that to support yourself and to support your family, just so you don't starve and you're not unhoused, you need to be able to work while you're waiting for that court decision to come through. And it's my understanding that, at least as of the phone call I joined, which was a couple of weeks ago, maybe, the administration was not issuing work visas to anyone from a banned country, even if they had filed for asylum, even if they're here in the United States. And so what that means is, in the case of this family that's on parole, I think they're in a couple of different tranches because it's adult siblings that aren't all legally part of the same family, even if they are effectively. Their visas or their existing work visas expire sometime between the summer and next fall. And that's an absolutely terrifying thing that they could. I would assume that from a policy perspective, the goal is to have them self-deport back to Afghanistan, but I don't know what other options they will have available to them. And this is the case where the father was, when they were all in Pakistan, he was still being sought by Pakistani intelligence services. And who knows what they wanted from him, but none of us wanted to find out. They had to move, quickly to another location and rent it under the name of a relative.
Just so sad to hear that.
It's a new level of cruelty, and I don't know
All
what.
of these stories. Yeah, I am pretty much out of words myself. I had to say that the other day, recording with Andrew Sullivan, and usually he brings so much hope when he comes on, always. And it's like, no, I think everybody's at a very low point right now, and I don't know how to change that. But I know everybody's still fighting for it. And I know that the work authorization is a problem for everybody who came in with HP from, OAW, because that went away. And, like, you got the 2-year extension under Biden at the very last hour, but then there was no extension under Trump. And so I know of hundreds of people who have no work authorization right now and can't work and can't support their families. And so it's already an issue for some people. And yeah, I don't know. I think if we can all, the thing I've always loved about this work is, we talked about this before we started recording too, it brings people together from across the spectrum. And I think we've lost that a little bit recently. I've seen it where people are starting to splinter out. And some of the best things I've seen happen have been when people who might not even really gel worked together and got some amazing Hail Mary to come through. And we need that again. And it's hard because there's a lot of pain.
I have a good positive story to
Good. That'll
turn.
be an ending. I'm going to let you end on a positive story. Jordan,
Yeah,
please give me some hope,
absolutely.
please.
It's not Afghanistan specific, but I was part of a community organization. I founded a community organization when my husband and I lived in the Chicago suburbs. And through that organization, there was a young woman who was one of our members. Her mom was a university professor. I think we had met briefly, but we didn't know each other well, at Lake Forest College, which is in the Chicago suburbs. And she had an F1, a student visa, like freshman incoming from Gaza right before the war broke out in Gaza. And she knew about my work with my sources and helping them to reach safety because of this organization and our common network. And so she sent me an email and said, and in fact, I just got another update from her a few days ago. She said, I've got this student and he's in Gaza and he has an active, like, he's got the stamp in his passport. He just needs permission to cross the border. And at this time, as far as I've been able to tell, no Gazan had been able to use that Rafah crossing into Egypt. And so I said to her, I've got very little confidence that I can help you at all, but I am happy to shake some trees. Like, I became just totally shameless about, as so many of us did, about contacting anyone who might be able to help, because you do hear about that one woman that I was able to help get on the flight to EHC, and then she's in Ottawa now. Like that, she got the last seat on that flight. That's a whole nother story.
Wow.
But in any case, this young man in Gaza, I was put in touch with the wife of the deputy Char's chief of mission chargé d'affaires, like the number 2 for the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. And she said, I'm going to make this my mission. Like, we're going to get this done. And I was just like, that's not possible. Another person that I know who works in advocacy for refugees was like, I'm going to get the passport moved, because you had to somehow get the passport across the border. I don't remember. In any case, it's to my great shock and surprise, we got him across the border. He got to Egypt with the stamp. He was the first Gazan to be able to do so, and is studying. I can report, I won't use his name, but I can report that he really enjoyed spring break in Cancun.
Wow.
The latest picture that I got was from, tubing down a river in the Midwest. Like, the little updates that I get. I got somebody, his professor just told me what he's majoring in. It's a super practical major. I'm going to connect him with my husband's friends so that he can do some exploration of jobs. But
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That was a wild ride, and I couldn't believe that it worked.
That's incredible. And that's the whole thing here is like, sometimes it does work. I have to remember that, because I feel like I've not had any good success stories lately. And it gets so demoralizing when you have to tell people like, I can't, there's nothing I can do for you. And then maybe that you can. That's really a good one.
It was this Afghan evac network that came together. I mean, I just started pinging people, and all of a sudden people were like, you know what? I've got bandwidth, and let's do it. And I was just like,
yeah, that's amazing. And I've seen it too. I mean, all of these Afghan groups, the withdrawal groups, I remember when Ukraine hit, and they all figured out, even though they were already overtasked, they figured out how to go help. So many of them did in Ukraine in the beginning to, make sure that there were basics for people and moving people out of the conflict zone. And it's been really beautiful to see what humans can do as a result of this work. It's just hard when you run up against the walls of bureaucracy over and over and over again until like your nose is smushed.
And there's been, you and I were talking about this earlier, just some beautiful, strange bedfellows, people from very different ideological or just geographical time of life, old people, young people. It's been a really beautiful thing to see Americans come together on this issue.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. There have been times where I remember my mom was visiting one time, and I held this woman in such great esteem, and I was afraid she would hate me because of who I wrote for and whatever. And she did not. And we worked together on things. And I remember telling my mom, I get to go interview her. And I was like just beaming from ear to ear, running down my stairs, so excited to get to do that. And telling people, like, because to me, that was like, we both care about this so much that neither of us, thinks if we were to tell the organizations we work for, I'm about to go sit with this person who does this for this group, our groups have been like, no. And yet none of us cared. We didn't care. So it was just so beautiful. Yeah. And there were so many moments like that where, strange bedfellows, but we just care. And that's the way the world should be, I think, where we all care. And it's not, the D or the R behind your name is not your defining characteristic. It's what are you willing to do for another human?
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Yeah. And I forget that. I would never go back to the way my life was before this ever, because of what it has taught me about humanity. And it's horrible. It's hell. I've cried so many times. I've lost a lot of things. And yet in the end, I've gained so much more because I've been part of it.
I feel like when someone comes to me with something like this now, I feel so alive and trying to make it happen, because I have had, I manage expectations, but I'm more likely to say yes and raise my hand and try to be a helper.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us like that.
Isn't that I think it's the coolest thing. And, it's a blessing to realize that you can. I was somebody who always would have said probably no before because it might have been too difficult and whatever. And then, I don't know, getting sucked into these rabbit holes, it's like, no, you know what? You might be amazed at what you can do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, with a little bit of will. Well, is there anything you wanted to talk about that I didn't ask you about that you want to
No,
say
I don't
before we
think so. I
close?
just really appreciate the opportunity to come on here. As I said, I've been an admirer of your work for a while, and I think especially the documentation of the reprisals, that was such a painful topic when we were trying to file these humanitarian parole applications. There was a lot of pushback that the official line was that reprisal killings weren't happening. And then it became, why does it matter? What can we do about it? It's not our problem. But it was, in the sense that it was the seminal fact in the application for the parole cases.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, I don't think I've told this story on the podcast before. In November of 21, my first, when I got those reprisal videos, I was writing two different articles for two different places that I wrote for. And one of them just took everything I said and said, great, good, we're putting it out. The other one said that they pushed back on the reprisals. They said, you're taking all the information from Digital Dunkirk and putting it here. And it's like, no, that's what's happening currently.
Yeah.
Inside Afghanistan. It's November of 21. This is still going on, and I'm not repackaging anything. It's ongoing. But it was the reprisals part that really, really irked me. So anyway, I remember because very shortly after that, the New York Times started covering it. Human Rights Watch started covering it. All the dominoes started falling. But I knew it was happening because I had the videos. I had the photographs. I knew what was going on. And it was so sickening. And now the problem is that no one cares anymore. For a while, it was, oh my gosh, this is terrible. And now it's kind of like Afghan women. Oh, it's terrible. Oh, it's just happening. And we don't do anything about it. So I'm so glad you were here, Jordan. This was it was great to get to know you too. I'm excited now to have, you and my circle of contacts doing all the excellent things you're doing. And I just want to thank everybody who got to watch us have a really intense conversation. And come back next week because there's sure to be another one. So Tasha Kaur, see you again soon.